And you'll find out why tonight they don't understand themselves. And you'll also find out a little bit about what makes them tick, because we are learning more and more and more about the teenage brain, how it grows, how it develops, and the most important thing we've learned of all is the fact that the brain of any human being is not fully mature until around age 25. So that's something. Until around age 25. We also know excuse me, exactly what parts of the brain mature last. It's the frontal and prefrontal parts of the brain. The thinking, reasoning, logical parts mature last. And probably you could all leave now if that's all you needed to know. Because you're already saying, well, I kind of knew that because I can't talk sense to my teenagers. Well, of course you can't. Because the emotional parts of their brains are the parts that are most active all of the time. And that's why, as we will see, they do some of the things they do. Now we have to have some caveats in the beginning because it's important to recognize that while we are learning a lot from neuroscience about the human brain, how it grows and develops, we really don't know a lot just yet. We've got a lot of interesting tidbits. We've learned huge amounts about the impact of trauma and neglect on the developing brain, but we're not here to talk about that. But we're beginning to understand how teenagers grow their brains. And one of the things that's really important for you to recognize is that every single thing you say and you do around your children changes the structure of their brain. Everything. We are constantly having our brain's neural pathways solidified, changed, sometimes pruned a little bit, like you might prune a tree, by environmental events. And most of the research that, in terms of brain growth and maturation that we really understand has been done on animals, in particular rats. And you will hear me talk a little bit about what we've learned in terms of the influence of alcohol on the adolescent brain from studies of the influence of alcohol on the rat brain. Why do we use rats? Well, because we've had thousands of generations of rats in laboratories for years. We can control their environment. And most of what we know about neuroscience has been learned from studying rat brains, believe it or not. Maybe unfortunate, but nonetheless, that's how we know it, and that's how we get to know things. Complex interactions in terms of the development of the human being. Interactions that begin at the moment of conception and all through the gestation period, and of course at birth, and in the environment after birth, and in the environment as the child grows and develops. One of the things I like to remind myself in terms of teenage development is when our young children between the ages of, let's say, 18 months and up, begin to sit up and crawl and walk and all that, we can actually observe their difficulties in learning to do those incredibly complex motor behaviors. We can see them stumble and fall. We can see them land on their little bums and try to get up and steady themselves on the furniture, etc. It's observable with our eyes. What we can't observe so much is the emotional development of the teenager. We don't really see it. We hear it, and we're all aware of the mood swings of the adolescent. You know, one minute they love you, the next minute they hate you, one minute they don't want you anywhere near them. Have you ever tried to walk in the shopping center here next to your 14, 15-year-old daughter or son? They don't want you anywhere near them. And there's good psychological reasons for that. Yet at the same time, you may be standing in the kitchen and discover they're right next to you, standing in your way. Why? Well, they're really kind of getting their love tank filled that way, believe it or not. So we know a few things, and we know something about adolescence. Interestingly, by the way, it's a really Western concept. We've invented this thing. Because if you study or work with indigenous populations, there really isn't a period of adolescence. You are a child, and then you enter full adult life of your tribe. And that transition is often accompanied by some kind of ritual. I had the privilege many years of working in Nairobi, Kenya, and met many good friends there, and very often young men in their 30s or whatnot would introduce me to a friend. And they said, "This is my friend John. We've been friends for a long time. We were circumcised together." And that just sounds so strange, but if you think of it, that of course in some indigenous populations is the transition ritual from being a child to an adult. We don't have that. I suppose getting your driver's license is as close as we're ever going to get to such a genuine, bona fide demarcation. So we have sort of dreamt up this concept of adolescence. I don't know why this little thing is here, but I'll try to get rid of it. It just popped up on its own. Of course, this thing we call adolescence begins with physical changes, biological changes, which, by the way, are happening at younger and younger ages now. And I think we all know that, particularly the girls are reaching puberty much earlier than we thought. There are nutritionists and physicians and dietitians who speculate it has a lot to do with the high-fat content in foods in the Western world. So the age of physical maturity vastly exceeds the age of mental maturity. They're ready to become adult-like in terms of physical characteristics long before their brain has any possibility of actually coping and thinking through these things. So it's all sorts of transitions, on and on it goes. Cognitive development changes throughout the course of adolescence. I've already mentioned that. For the young adolescent, and by we call young adolescent, let's say typically between the ages of 12, 14, maybe 15, the world is not a very nuanced place at all. It's very much black and white. You've probably noticed this. People are either all good or they're all bad. Your idea is either all bad or all good. You try to explain the nuance and the depth and breadth of concepts to them. They don't get it. It's not that they don't want to join with you in your thinking. It's that they can't. No parent or teacher who's working with teenagers should ever assume that a conversation you're having is genuine communication, because it really isn't. We're very often talking at one level, and they're listening with another level. Now let me just take a little divergence here and talk about the 3 ages of every human being, because everyone in this room, much like our children, has 3 different ages. The easiest one to understand is our chronological age. I am X number of years old. That's fixed. It cannot be changed. We can lie about it a little bit, but we really can't change it. Looks may deceive, and this is something that's important because I was talking about the earlier physical changes of adolescence. Looks can deceive. And when we look at a teenager who appears to be much older than their chronological years, our expectations raise about them. We begin to expect more mature behavior. We expect for them to be able to think clearly and reason logically. But looks really can deceive. Likewise, it can work in the opposite direction, by the way. I've got 14, 15, 16-year-old boys in my practice that look like they're about 10 or 11. This will come as no surprise to the ladies in the room. Gentlemen, I'm sorry to give it away. The male brain matures slower than the female brain, as does the male body by and large on average. But you can have a 13-year-old who looks like he's 17, or she looks like she's 17. You can have a 13-year-old that looks like they're 8. So it's very deceiving, this chronological age. The next age that we all have is our intellectual age. Now this is an interesting age because it can be equal to chronological age, it can be well above chronological age, or it can be well below chronological age. We're really talking about level of intelligence here when I say intellectual age. Most of us are average, and average is good enough. So therefore our intellectual age equals our chronological age, and they move in some kind of synchronicity through the lifespan. Some children, and you know this, are born incredibly bright. We call them gifted or exceptionally able, and they ask deeply profound questions very early on. I'll give you an example. In Eason's bookshop not all that long ago, I was just browsing, and there was a gentleman browsing the books, and his son, who was about 7 or 8, I reckon, was seated on the floor with a child's book open as Daddy was looking through his books. And in a very loud voice, the boy said, and I remember it as if it was just yesterday, and I will quote, "Daddy, why did God send me to this family?" What a profound question when you think about it. Out of the mouth of an 8-year-old boy. A deeply profound question. Of course, Father was quite flustered and said, "Shh! We don't talk loud in the bookshop. We'll talk about that at home, okay?" Now, this is a question about the purpose of being alive, the purpose of having a family. It's a good question, isn't it? Why did God send you to your family? And there's all kinds of answers. There's theistic answers, there's creedal answers, dogmatic answers, there's humanistic answers. I'll give you my answer. And you can just think about it. You can dismiss it even if you want. I think the reason children were sent to our particular family is because our family, out of all the billions and billions of families in the world, is the only one that can provide the fertile ground for them to put their taproot of their great spirit in and grow and mature to be what they were meant to be. Only your family can do that. That's what I think. Maybe airy-fairy a little bit, but I like to think it. It comforts me because I have 2 children. They're all grown up now. I'm proud to say they've managed, I think, to recover sufficiently from all the parenting mistakes that we made along the way. Because if you ever listen to Moncrief, you hear me say over and over again, you don't have to be a good parent. You just have to be a good enough parent. Good enough is good enough. We live in the age, ladies and gentlemen, of paranoid parenting. We're constantly being bombarded with the dangers that confront children in this world, all the things that can go wrong, how hard their life is, how complicated the world is. All of that is true, of course. The world is incredibly complicated now. Think of the information that they're exposed to every minute of the day that we weren't exposed to. Certainly that I wasn't. We didn't have technology. Well, it was low tech back in my childhood. And so we worry and fret, and then of course we have the so-called, like me, parenting expert. I'm not even an expert at being David Carey, to be honest. What we all need, I think, is a kind of a gigantic 12-step program in which you can stand up and say, "Hello, my name is David, and I'm a recovering human being." Because it's difficult. It's difficult. And being a parent these days is 100 times more difficult than it was when I was surviving all the parenting mistakes that my parents made. And if you look at your trajectory in terms of how you were parented and how you are parenting, and if you can see slow, steady, upward, forward progress, you're doing it good enough. That's all you need. Of course, we learn how to be parents from how we were parented. There isn't a rule book. Loads of people write books about parenting. I'm supposed to be writing one myself. I don't know if we need any more parenting books. What we need is just be a good enough parent and trust yourself. Puberty, you can see in the left-hand column there all the kinds of things that are going on in puberty. With age and experience, on the right-hand side, we have a whole bunch of functions that moderate everything on the left-hand side. So sexual interest becomes moderated by our ability to inhibit our sexual impulses and whatnot. Now, I was talking about the intellectual age of every child. This is where things in the right-hand column really come into play. Because if you're incredibly gifted in terms of your intellectual endowment, which just seems to be genetic at birth, and certainly influenced by the environment, you're going to have a lot of these experiences and abilities on the right-hand side that are greatly advanced for your age. And this is why we notice so often that children who are exceptionally able have profound difficulties in the social world around them, because they think at a level much higher than other children, and they expect other children to think the same way they do. And they're not particularly good at interacting with other children, and they're not particularly good sometimes at forgiving other children for not being as able to understand the world around them as they are. See? So intellectual age can be much higher than chronological age, and we interact with those children differently. They ask very troubling questions. Daddy, why did God give me to this family? I don't know what the answer to that question is. I gave you my answer. Likewise, intellectual age can be significantly lower than chronological age. We call that all kinds of things in psychology and education, learning disabilities, general learning disabilities. In America, in North America, we use very old-fashioned terminology, still mental retardation. But it's meant to describe and define how a person thinks and how they are able to think. And so if you have a particularly lower intellectual age than your chronological age, you're going to have a lot of difficulty with things on the right-hand side here. And that means when you become a teenager, things like frustration tolerance, impulse control, anger management become more challenging and difficult for you, because all those kind of things that we talk about all the time in regards to children are really developing and percolating in the frontal parts of the brain, the thinking, reasoning parts of the brain, as opposed to the deep-seated emotional centers of the human brain. So, two ages we've spoken about: chronological age, intellectual age. Chronological age fixed, but looks can deceive. Intellectual age can be equal to chronological age, well above, or well below, or a little above, or a little below. When we get to the extremes, that's when we begin to see some significant difficulties here. That too, don't we? Procrastination, we call it, self-defeating behavior. And we're very quick to come to judgment about them, aren't we? And we call them lazy, messers, poorly motivated students. We have in our adult minds a very rich put-down vocabulary of younger people that come trickling out of us, probably because they were put into us in the first place by a lot of the adults in our lives. If you think what education is, most unfortunately of all, correction of mistakes rather than any kind of focus on effort and success. You get a spelling test back and you find out immediately how many you've gotten wrong, as opposed to how many you've done successfully. And year after year after year after year, an endless stream of correction of your mistakes. It can be weary. It can be a heavy load for some children who are struggling to learn and whose brain just mightn't let them get their assignment done on time because their brain doesn't know how to break it down into small component steps and how to evaluate their progress over time and how to change the plan as they go along. And if you can't do that, if your brain won't let you, you're going to be at odds with your learning environment. The transition from childhood to what we call adolescence is a very difficult transition, because along with all this brain development and along with all this physical change, excuse me, too much talking today, is the changes of psychological development. What is the main task of adolescence at the psychological level? Well, it's really quite simple but difficult to achieve. I want to become a tree that stands before the forest. Who is the tree? That's the teenager. Who is the forest? That's the family. And that's where the power of the peer reference group becomes so enormous, because you're moving away from traditional family values. You now want to become an individual. We have fancy words for that. We call it individuation, the main task of adolescence. I'm not just a part of this family, I'm a me. I am an I, and I have these thoughts and these feelings and these ideas, and the pendulum sometimes swings very far away from more core traditional family values. I remember extremely well, as if it was yesterday, Bridget, my youngest, who now is 38, she'd love me saying that, and the mother of 3 boys, and I just keep saying her, it's payback time now, Bridget. And she hates me for that, too. But I remember it. She was around 12, 13 years of age. We were seated around the dinner table, and she said, I have something to say. We knew we were in trouble. Right away we knew we were in trouble. What's that, Bridget? I'm not a Catholic anymore. I'm a Protestant. In many ways, she was right, because she spent the next 8 years protesting everything. Now she's raising her boys as a Catholic. Not that that means anything one way or the other. I'm just using that as an example. This tremendous movement away from what was traditional in terms of our core family operating system, although we weren't like real, church-going, Bible-carrying Catholics, but we went to church, as you do sometimes. And that's how she was reared, but no more. She wasn't going to be a Catholic. I don't know if she ever set foot in the Congregational Church down the road, by the way. I still don't know what she meant by being a Protestant, but it's as good an example as you can get of this transition and the psychological movement. Now, our ability to become an I and live in this world as a we is largely dependent on something important that happens very early in life: attachment. Maybe you've heard the word. The bond between the primary caregivers, not just the caregiver, the primary caregivers, and the infant. It's formed very early on, right from the moment of birth, in fact. One of the things we have learned about the human brain is that it is incredibly visual. The back part of our brain, the occipital lobe, is the part for vision, and we can hold up a very newborn infant within about 8 minutes after birth to the face of the mother, and if the mother thrusts out her tongue, the infant will copy that movement. Now, so powerful is the visual system in the brain that it begins to form attachment. If attachment goes well, then we know we're rearing healthy, young children who will make a relatively smooth transition into the teenage years and then later on into adult life. Because this bond we have, this thing we call attachment, lays down the neural pathways that enable us to trust other people. And if you can trust other people, you can move out into the world further and further away from your attachment figure. And this is important and this is necessary. We move away from the family home. We think differently. By the way, the research in terms of the change in values from core family values to extreme during adolescence, one of the things that we've learned in the last few years is that by the time young adulthood comes and middle years, the values have switched back to what they were in the family. So don't be alarmed when your 13-year-old announces that he's a Protestant, or the opposite, a Catholic, or an atheist, or whatever, I don't know if any of that stuff is all that important anyway, but in terms of thinking about the right way to live in the world and the wrong way to live in the world, you'll see some changes, but they swing back. So don't be alarmed. The last sentence here is really important, and if you take nothing else from this evening but this, you've got enough. Normal adolescent development includes all those things listed there. Conflict, facing insecurities, mood swings, being totally self-absorbed to the exclusion of everyone else. That is normal adolescent behavior. So the next time you find yourself pulling what's left of your hair out and saying, he only cares about himself and no one else in this family, good, you've got a normal teenager on your hands. Right? And so the best thing you can do during the teenage years, if you're a parent or an educator, fasten your safety belt. All About Eve, when Betty Davis walks down the stairs, fasten your safety belt. It's going to be a bumpy night, and you're going to have some bumpy years. But these things are normal. And we really need to begin to understand that. We focus in psychology and psychiatry and social work so much on what's abnormal and not enough on what's normal. Let me give you an example. We know a hell of a lot about why some parents beat their children. We know that because we've been studying them for years. We don't know next to anything about why parents don't beat their children. Wouldn't it be important to know that? What is it that we all have that some other human beings don't have? Because if we can identify it, rarefy it, then we can help them get it through educational models and interventions, etc. So we're very often just studying all the wrong populations all of the time. I talked about the underdevelopment of the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. In adolescence, they are very prone to gut reactions, it says here. In other words, supercharged emotional reactions. It is the limbic system that works first. It does not communicate with the frontal lobe, the thinking part of the brain. We have this structure. It's listed here, the amygdala. It's the center of our emotional life. Of course, in the human brain, there are no emotions. It's really just chemicals and electricity, but we label them as emotions. This thing, the amygdala, fires instantaneously in the face of new sensory input. Anything new the brain perceives is perceived as possibly threatening. Anything new, any new experience, any new sight, any new sound, any new taste, anything. So the amygdala communicates very quickly to another part of the human brain, the hippocampus. That's the part that contains memory. And if the hippocampus tells the amygdala, yep, seen this before, the whole system calms down. No stress, no threat. If the hippocampus has no reference for it whatsoever, then the brain goes into threat mode. The stress response, fight, flee, or freeze. We've learned a lot about that. We know the boys are much more likely to fight or flee, and the girls much more likely to freeze under conditions of severe stress. What can be severe stress for the teenager? That could be in the classroom where a teacher is shouting at another student. We call that second level post-traumatic stress disorder sometimes when clinical symptoms develop. You do not have to be the victim of a stressful circumstance to have the same identical response in terms of your brain's threat response system that the victim does. So witnessing or overhearing intense conflicts is just as unsettling. Now, we're not here to talk about trauma, but I'm giving you an example of all that happens in the limbic system of the brain, which is deep in the core of the brain, the cerebral cortex around it here. That's the thinking part, and there's no communication until a few nanoseconds after the emotional discharge has happened. Then there's some communication. But first to the hippocampus, which doesn't think or reason, it just remembers. And only then can the frontal part of the brain begin to think through things. And I'm sure John, in a lot of his lectures, touches on this because we know a lot about the minds of violent criminals and violent teenagers that is helping us understand the mechanisms that cause them to do some of the things that they do. We don't know what to do about it yet to correct it very efficiently, unfortunately. Correcting these things is labor-intensive, time-intensive, and remember I said at the beginning, there are caveats. We don't know everything we need to know yet, and we're not going to know it all for another 100 years or more. The brain is an incredibly complex system. So in the mind of the teenager, there is a decrease in rational, logical thinking and an increase in impulsiveness. So our teenagers do what they think about doing before they think about doing what they think about doing. It's a rather awkward sentence. We can simplify it. It's sometimes called the ready, fire, aim syndrome. Because that ability to think through things isn't fully developed just yet. That's where we have done in our families preliminary work to talk about what's right and what's wrong, and to provide consequences for seriously wrong misbehavior, shoplifting, for example, which is not a trivial thing, but a lot of teenagers fall into it. They don't think through it clearly. So we have to provide a corrective experience there. That doesn't mean beating the hell out of them, by the way. That means telling them that it must be returned, and you're going there with them, and they'll have to talk to the store manager, and you will explain your case, et cetera, et cetera. I said talk a little bit about children on the spectrum, the autism spectrum, particularly the higher end. Very interesting thing in terms of what we know about young people with Asperger's syndrome. We're not supposed to call it that anymore. It's all spectrum stuff now. Same wine, new bottle. Individuals who are on that end of the spectrum are very, very rigid in their thinking and always want to do what's right. They don't like to break rules. And so they most often don't break rules once they know what the rules are, that is. And you will find them sometimes very intolerant sitting in a classroom where other boys and or girls might be breaking the rules. And they can be very trivial rules, such as we're not supposed to talk in class while teacher is speaking. And it can be very distressing for a teenager with Asperger's syndrome to be seated in a classroom and there are 4 or 5 young people in another part of the classroom chitter-chattering away while teacher is speaking. And I have seen that just in the last month and a half, I treat a lot of young people with Asperger's. They just need a little bit of guidance, really. We shouldn't call it treatment. But what do they do when this happens? They go to the teacher and they say, you know, John, Margaret, and David were talking away constantly whilst you were talking about that math problem. And that doesn't make them very popular, as you can imagine. So this rigidity of thinking in the mind of a youngster with Asperger's syndrome is rule-bound and rule-driven. So in some ways, they're a little bit more advanced than the average expected teenager who isn't so tightly bound into the rule system of life and who is more susceptible to impulses, the ready, fire, aim syndrome. And here we have a built-in problem in terms of sexual development, because they're ready physiologically before their mind is ready. And it causes a lot of problems. Now, at the psychological level, I think we need to recognize as adults that young love in teenagers is real love. We sometimes are very dismissive of it, but it is real love for them, and it's rehearsal towards the drama of performing the final act of real interpersonal love. I'm not talking about physical intimacy here, I'm talking about the incredibly intense bond between 2 adults or older teenagers that develops this thing we call the love attachment. After happy, it's the most neurotic word in the world, love. Nobody can understand it, everybody wants it. Just like happy. I want to be happy. What do you want for your teenage son? I want him to be happy. Bertolt Brecht said, in the race for happiness, happiness always comes in last place. Learning how to assess risk and consequences happens late in adolescence. Do not expect your 12, 13, 14, and 15-year-old to be particularly sophisticated at it. As we will see later, what do they need, though, from us? Some guidance, some mentoring. They do not need constant discipline and put-downs. They do not need an endless series of rolling eyes. Oh, God, how could you have done that? How many times have I told you? And the right answer to that is, by my count, Mom, about 749 as of today. And Dad is ahead of you a little bit, it's 876. That's how many times. But they don't need to hear that over and over and over again. They need a little autopsy on misbehavior. Can I give you an idea of what an autopsy is? We're really talking about a little conversation that can take only about 2 or 3 minutes if you do it right and you stay calm. So it's a good idea to be calm when you try to do it. We are going to try with our teenagers to help them interpret their environment, look at the mistakes they've made, just human mistakes after all, that's how we learn, and to try not to make the same mistake too many times over and over again. Sometimes we need more than one trial to learn properly. And so, in terms of mistakes in living and behavior, sometimes we need to make the same mistake a good few times before we've learned. So how can you do this autopsy? Very simple. David, what did you do about a half hour ago? I kicked the door. All right. What happened when you did it? I hurt my foot. Okay, that's a rather simplistic answer, but maybe truthful enough. The best question is the diagnostic question. What could you have done differently instead of kicking the door? You were angry, is that right? Is that why you kicked the door with your foot? Yeah. What could you have done differently? Now, I said that's a diagnostic question because the answer the child gives you will teach you what you need to do next. Because if the answer is, I should have smashed my foot through it, it tells you that the child or that teenager does not have a good repertoire of pro-social skills. I would assume that they're not being flip with you, by the way. I mean, sometimes you get answers like that. I remember a 12-year-old boy who had body slammed a child in the schoolyard. This goes back before Conor McGregor's days. This was when wrestling was very popular. He smashed the boy down on the tarmac, and there was a rather serious injury. And in talking with him after, his parents brought him to me. You know, you have to solve this problem. God, I don't know how to solve that problem, but what did you do? I body slammed him. Well, what could you have done differently? I should have kicked him in the ghoulies. That's what I should have done. That is a quote now. Right? Now that teaches me something about that boy and informs me what I have to do next, because he doesn't have a pro-social response. So now my job as a guide and as a parent is difficult. I have to teach him one, and then I have to facilitate its emergence and use. You see it? That's complicated. Now, if instead he said, I should have walked away and just talked to the teacher. Aha! Now we know he has a pro-social repertoire. My job is a little simpler. I have to facilitate its emergence. Now that's going to take time too, but it's less complicated than having to teach a whole new set of skills, extinguish a maladaptive set of skills, and facilitate the emergence of the new skills. That's really complicated parenting. So these little questions that you can ask: what did you do? What happened when you did it? What could you have done a little bit differently next time? Let's just talk about, now you have this conversation, it takes only 5 minutes, by the way, and you have this conversation when they're calm and you're calm, and you're not going to tell them I'm docking your pocket money for the next 7 years to pay for a new door, which you may have to go down a road like that at some point, because correction must be made in the context of the family home. We have a responsibility to discipline our teenagers. Let's just talk about the word though for a minute. It's an interesting word. What is the root of the word discipline? A disciple. What is a disciple? A disciple is an individual who follows a great and wise teacher. You are the great wise teacher. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, punishment is not discipline, because it doesn't teach anything. It tells children what they're not supposed to do, but it doesn't replace it with something they ought to be doing instead. Discipline teaches. We perform the act of discipline to put ourselves out of the discipline business. The nice thing about it is it's a sinecure. You'll never be out of work, because these are our children, and these are our teenagers, and they make mistakes, and they have immature brains, and they can't think through things logically, and they have difficulty handling social pressure. Please think back for a moment to your secondary school years. I'm kind of old now, mature, but not fully grown yet. And I can remember my high school days. They were just hell. All these big adults were constantly correcting me, telling me what I could and couldn't do. I can remember when Orange Joe, we used to call him Pumpkin Joe, he was my English teacher. He actually saved my life, by the way, illustrating the point that a good teacher can actually save a child's life in so many ways. But Pumpkin Joe was very much strict on the rules. He wore these really ochre-colored suits all the time. And so he looked like a pumpkin, so he was Pumpkin Joe. But walking down the hall, holding Nancy's hand, my girlfriend who became my bride, don't hold hands in this hallway. Do you want, both of you want detention? Stop. Hit those hands, stop that. Why? Why? Why can't you wear a pierced ear in secondary school? Why can't you have purple hair? Why can't you wear a mohawk? Why are we so obsessed with what's on the child's head rather than what's in it? Now I know this will come as anathema to some teachers, but this business of rules, rules, rules in secondary school, and you have to actually ask permission to go to the toilet? I mean, for heaven's sakes, if your boss told you you cannot leave your desk until you raise your hand and I give you permission, you'd look for another job. And this is what we do to teenagers. We over-control them because we don't trust them. I have a hypothesis. I don't think we particularly love youth that much. We love beauty, and we love the notion of the perfectly beautiful male or female form, but the vigor and the psychological ebullience of the adolescent is something we don't really trust, because they can always make a mistake and get in trouble. Well, of course, that's true.